Imagine living in an era where taking a bath was considered dangerous, where doctors believed that dirt actually protected your body from diseases. Sounds absurd, doesn't it? But this is exactly how humanity lived for centuries. Picture this. You're in 15th century Europe. The streets are narrow and filthy. Waste is thrown directly onto the streets. And the concept of personal hygiene as we know it today simply doesn't exist. People of all social classes, from peasants to kings, shared the same peculiar belief. Water, especially warm water, would open up your pores and make you vulnerable to illness and death. The early modern era, spanning from the 15th to the 18th centuries, was a period of tremendous transformation. While the world witnessed revolutionary scientific discoveries, such as the circulation of blood discovered by William Harvey and the invention of the microscope by Antony van Leeuwenhoek, personal and public hygiene began to gain new importance. But how did society deal with cleanliness in an age full of contradictions? Did you know that King Louis XIV, the famous Sun King of France, reportedly only took 2 baths in his entire life? Instead of bathing, the nobility would change their linen undergarments and apply copious amounts of perfume to mask their body odor. The wealthier you were, the stronger your perfume. Today, we're going to explore this fascinating journey through one of history's most transformative periods. We'll discover how scientific breakthroughs slowly began to change centuries-old habits, how cities struggled with public sanitation, and how the foundations were laid for the modern hygiene practices we take for granted today. If you love history and want to unravel the mysteries of the great empires, please like this video, subscribe to the Modern Age Chronicles channel, and don't miss a single episode. Hit that notification bell to join us on our journey through the most fascinating chapters of human history. Now, let's dive into the remarkably unclean world of early modern hygiene, where science and superstition collided in the most unusual ways. Before we dive into the early modern era, we need to understand what came before. The Middle Ages laid the foundation for many of the hygiene practices, or lack thereof, that continued into later centuries. In medieval times, hygiene was largely neglected, and for reasons that might surprise you. Bathing was a rare luxury, not because water was scarce, but because of prevailing medical theories. People genuinely believed that hot water would open the pores of their skin, leaving their bodies vulnerable to disease and illness. This wasn't just a superstition of the uneducated. Even physicians of the time warned against frequent bathing. Imagine living in a world where cleanliness wasn't associated with health, but rather with danger. The dirtier you were, the safer you felt. Dirt was actually viewed as a protective layer against the mysterious ailments that plagued medieval society. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the 14th century, killing millions, fear intensified, and many abandoned even occasional bathing. What's fascinating is that the early Middle Ages actually had a more developed bathing culture than the later periods. Public bathhouses were common throughout Europe, continuing a tradition inherited from the Romans. People would gather in these communal spaces not just to bathe, but to socialize. However, as devastating epidemics like the Black Death ravaged communities, these bathhouses began to be viewed with suspicion. Officials blamed them for spreading disease, as people of all health conditions bathed together in the same water. Did you know that as the Middle Ages progressed, people began to believe that changing their linen undergarments would keep them clean? Rather than washing their bodies, they would simply change their underclothes and consider themselves refreshed. The logic was that the linen would absorb the dirt and sweat from their bodies. Speaking of fascinating hygiene habits, King Louis XIV, the famous Sun King of France, reportedly took only 2 baths in his entire lifetime. This wasn't considered unusual for a monarch of his era. He firmly believed that water would weaken his body and instead preferred to mask his natural odor with intense perfumes. His court at Versailles, though magnificent in its architecture and artistry, was notoriously smelly. Courtiers would apply perfume liberally to their clothes, wigs, and even their furniture. The medieval approach to hygiene wasn't limited to personal cleanliness. Towns and cities had rudimentary, if any, sewage systems. Waste was routinely thrown directly onto the streets, creating an environment where disease could thrive. The connection between filth and illness wasn't yet understood, though some observant individuals did notice that cleaner areas tended to have fewer outbreaks of disease. So, as we transition into discussing the early modern era, remember that these people inherited centuries of misinformation and fear surrounding hygiene. The revolutionary changes in thinking about cleanliness didn't happen overnight. They emerged gradually against this backdrop of deeply ingrained beliefs that had shaped European society for hundreds of years. With the dawn of the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, everything began to change. After centuries of medieval darkness and superstition, a new light of inquiry and discovery was being cast upon the world. This wasn't just a shift in art and culture, it was a complete transformation in how people understood their bodies and the invisible world around them. Imagine being alive in the year 1628 when William Harvey made his groundbreaking discovery about blood circulation. Before Harvey, people believed in the ancient Greek idea that blood was constantly being consumed by the body and needed to be replenished through food. Harvey proved that blood actually circulates continuously through the body, pumped by the heart. This revelation completely changed how physicians understood the human body. For the first time, they began to see the body as a complex system rather than a mysterious vessel filled with four humors that needed to be balanced. But perhaps even more revolutionary for hygiene was the invention of the microscope. When Antony van Leeuwenhoek, a Dutch cloth merchant with an insatiable curiosity, peered through his handcrafted lenses in the 1670s, he became the first human to witness an entirely new universe, the world of microorganisms. Can you imagine the shock and wonder he must have felt seeing thousands of tiny creatures swimming in a single drop of water? He called these tiny beings animalcules, and meticulously documented everything he saw. Leeuwenhoek was no trained scientist. He was a curious tradesman who ground his own lenses as a hobby. Yet his discoveries were so remarkable that the Royal Society of London, the most prestigious scientific organization of the time, initially doubted his findings until other scientists confirmed them. He examined everything from rainwater to his own dental plaque, discovering bacteria, protozoans, and even his own sperm cells. His work was the first step toward understanding the microscopic world that influences our health. Though the germ theory of disease wouldn't be fully developed until the 19th century by Louis Pasteur, these early scientific discoveries began to plant seeds of doubt about traditional beliefs. People started questioning the long-held idea that dirt provided protection against illness. If the body was a complex system of circulation, and if invisible creatures existed all around us, perhaps cleanliness deserved more attention. This period also saw the rise of empirical observation in medicine. Physicians began to notice patterns in disease outbreaks and slowly connected them to sanitary conditions. For example, in 1656, during a devastating plague outbreak in Rome, the papal physician Athanasius Kircher examined the blood of victims under a primitive microscope and suggested that tiny organisms might be responsible for the disease. Though his technology wasn't advanced enough to actually see the plague bacteria, his hypothesis was revolutionary. Another fascinating development came from the work of Sir Francis Bacon, who championed the scientific method. Bacon suggested that disease might spread through corrupted air or miasma, especially from rotting matter. While this wasn't quite germ theory, it did encourage people to keep their surroundings cleaner and better ventilated, a significant improvement for public health. As these scientific ideas spread among the educated classes, practical changes began to follow. Some physicians started recommending more regular washing of hands and face. Books on household management began to emphasize cleanliness not just for appearances, but as a matter of health. And while bathing the entire body was still viewed with suspicion by many, partial washing became more common, especially among the wealthy. The scientific revolution didn't transform hygiene practices overnight. Cultural habits are stubborn things that change slowly. But it planted the intellectual seeds that would eventually grow into modern understanding of hygiene and disease prevention. The microscope and discoveries about human anatomy opened people's eyes to a new way of thinking about cleanliness, setting the stage for the dramatic improvements that would follow in the centuries to come. Now, let's talk about something that might make you squirm a bit: personal hygiene in the early modern era. Believe it or not, taking a bath was considered quite dangerous during this time. Yes, you heard that right. Dangerous. In an age when we take daily showers for granted, imagine living in a time when people actively avoided water. Instead of washing, the wealthy and powerful would douse themselves in strong perfumes. The more expensive and potent your perfume, the higher your social status. The Palace of Versailles was actually nicknamed the Perfumed Court because of the overwhelming scent that permeated its halls. Speaking of Versailles, here's a fascinating detail about King Louis XIV, the famous Sun King. Throughout his 77 years of life, he reportedly only took 2 baths. 2! And this wasn't considered unusual. He was following the medical advice of his time. His morning routine instead consisted of being rubbed down with perfumed cloths and having his shirts changed several times a day. Clothing played a crucial role in what people considered cleanliness. Rather than washing their bodies, people would change their linen undergarments, believing that the white linen would draw out dirt and sweat from their skin. The wealthy would change these linens daily, while the poor might wear the same clothes for weeks or even months. Here's something that might surprise you. People actually believed that dirt on their clothes could help strengthen their bodies. The logic was that the layer of dirt provided protection against disease. Clothes were rarely washed, and when they were, it was usually just the visible parts that got attention. However, not everything was quite so grimy. Some European courts, particularly the French court, began developing more refined hygiene practices. They introduced the use of handkerchiefs, which was considered quite revolutionary at the time. Regular hand washing also became more common among the nobility, though it was still far from what we'd consider adequate today. The perfume industry boomed during this period, especially in places like Grasse, France, which became the perfume capital of the world. People would perfume everything: their clothes, their wigs, their furniture, even their letters. The stronger the smell, the better, as it needed to mask some pretty powerful body odors. Think about this. When people today go camping for a few days without a shower, they usually can't wait to get back to modern plumbing. Now imagine living your entire life without ever taking a proper bath. Could you handle the early modern era lifestyle? If you're finding this glimpse into historical hygiene fascinating, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles for more incredible stories from the past. Hit that notification bell to join us on more historical adventures. And here's a question for you. Do you think you could survive in an era without baths? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's continue our journey through the surprisingly fragrant yet not so clean world of early modern hygiene. Now, let me paint you a picture of city life in the early modern era, but I must warn you it's not a pretty one. Imagine walking through the narrow streets of London or Paris, where the concept of public sanitation was, well, let's just say it was still in its infancy. Picture yourself navigating these streets, trying to dodge not just the mud and garbage, but also the contents of chamber pots being emptied right from upper-story windows. Yes, you heard that right. People would simply shout, "Watch out below," or "Gardez-vous" in Edinburgh, before tossing their waste onto the streets. The term gardez-l'eau, by the way, comes from the French garder l'eau, meaning watch out for the water, though what was being thrown was rarely just water. The streets themselves were like open sewers. In London's Cheapside, one of the city's busiest markets, merchants would sell fresh food right next to rotting garbage. The smell was so overwhelming that many people carried pomanders, small perfumed balls, to hold under their noses while walking through the city. Here's a fascinating detail. In Venice, they had a slightly better system. The city's famous canals served as their sewage system, and while this might sound horrible, the daily tides actually helped flush everything out to sea. Not perfect, but certainly better than most European cities at the time. Disease was a constant companion in these urban environments. The bubonic plague would regularly sweep through cities, and typhus, also known as jail fever because it spread rapidly in prisons, was a common killer. In fact, during the famous Old Bailey sessions in London in 1750, the disease killed 40 people in the courtroom, including the Lord Mayor of London. But not all cities were content to wallow in filth. Some began taking steps toward better sanitation. Florence led the way by paving its streets as early as the 1400s, making it easier to clean them. Amsterdam developed an impressive system of canals and water management that helped keep the city relatively clean. And in Paris, they finally began building covered sewers in the 1600s, though it would take centuries before they had a comprehensive system. One of the most interesting innovations came from King Henry VIII of England. In 1531, he established the first public health law, the Bill of Sewers. This law created commissioners of sewers who were responsible for drainage and flood defenses. Though it wasn't perfect, it was a start. The relationship between filth and disease wasn't fully understood yet, but some cities began to notice patterns. During plague outbreaks, cities like Milan and Vienna would organize teams to clean the streets and remove garbage. They didn't know about germs, but they observed that cleaner cities tended to have fewer disease outbreaks. Perhaps the most ambitious cleanup effort was in Edinburgh. The city was so densely packed that they built upward, creating the world's first high-rise apartments, some reaching 14 stories. However, this vertical solution created its own problems, as waste thrown from upper floors had further to fall and more people to hit on the way down. Despite these challenges, the early modern period marked the beginning of organized urban sanitation. Cities started appointing street cleaners, establishing garbage collection points, and creating basic drainage systems. It wasn't much by today's standards, but it was the start of a revolution in public health that would transform urban life in the centuries to come. The next time you walk down a clean city street or flush a toilet, remember, these simple conveniences were once revolutionary ideas that took centuries to develop. Our ancestors faced incredible challenges in creating the urban environments we take for granted today, one step and one sewer at a time. Let's dive into one of the most fascinating aspects of the early modern era, the strange and often terrifying world of medicine. Trust me, after hearing about medical practices from this period, you'll never complain about going to the doctor again. Imagine you're feeling ill in the 1600s. Your local physician arrives wearing a long black coat and that infamous beaked mask filled with aromatic herbs. They believed these masks would protect them from miasma, or bad air, which they thought caused disease. The doctor takes one look at you and declares that your four humors are out of balance. Their solution? Bleeding you with leeches or cutting your veins to let out the bad blood. These doctors weren't trying to harm their patients. They genuinely believed in these treatments. The theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, had dominated medicine since ancient times. When someone got sick, doctors assumed these humors were imbalanced and needed to be corrected, usually through rather aggressive means. Speaking of aggressive treatments, let me tell you about King Charles II's last days. When the king fell ill in 1685, his doctors subjected him to an absolutely shocking series of treatments. They bled him repeatedly, gave him violent purgatives, placed burning hot irons on his shaven head, and forced him to swallow a mixture containing, among other things, powdered human skull. Spoiler alert, these treatments didn't save him. But not everyone followed these traditional practices. Enter Paracelsus, a Swiss physician who dared to challenge the medical establishment in the 1500s. He was quite a character. He actually burned the books of ancient medical authorities in public. Paracelsus insisted that diseases had specific causes and needed specific treatments, not just the usual bleeding and purging. He was also one of the first to suggest that external factors, like poor sanitation, might cause illness. Then there was Thomas Sydenham, often called the English Hippocrates. Working in the 1600s, he did something revolutionary. He actually observed his patients carefully and kept detailed records of their symptoms and recovery. Imagine that, actually watching what happened to sick people instead of just following ancient books. He began to recognize that cleanliness might play a role in healing, though he couldn't quite explain why. Here's a fascinating detail. Some doctors began to notice that midwives who washed their hands had better success rates with deliveries. However, it would take another 200 years before hand washing became standard medical practice. Can you believe that? Something we teach toddlers today was once a revolutionary medical concept. One of the most interesting developments came from an unlikely source: barber surgeons. These practitioners, who combined haircuts with medical procedures, were often more practical than university-trained physicians. They began to notice that clean instruments and clean working conditions led to better outcomes for their patients. Though they didn't understand germ theory, their practical observations were slowly pushing medicine toward better hygiene practices. Medical treatments could be bizarrely specific. Got a headache? The doctor might prescribe a poultice made from pigeon droppings. Stomach problems? How about wearing a fox pelt over your abdomen? And if you had a toothache, you might be advised to kiss a donkey. Yes, these were real treatments recommended by medical professionals of the time. But perhaps the most important development was the gradual shift from seeing illness as a punishment from God or an imbalance of mysterious humors to viewing it as something that could be studied, understood, and prevented. This fundamental change in thinking would eventually lead to the medical revolution of the 19th century. The next time you visit a doctor's office with its sterile environments and evidence-based treatments, remember, it took centuries of trial and error, and yes, quite a few bizarre experiments to get there. Our modern understanding of hygiene and disease prevention didn't appear overnight. It was built on the shoulders of those who dared to question traditional wisdom and look for better answers. As we wrap up our journey through the early modern era, let's take a moment to consider the incredible legacy this period left behind. Think of it as humanity's awkward teenage years. We were starting to figure things out, making plenty of mistakes along the way, but laying the groundwork for something revolutionary. You know that moment when you first realize something that seems obvious in hindsight. That's exactly what happened during these centuries. People were slowly beginning to connect the dots between cleanliness and health, even if they didn't fully understand why. It's like they were solving a puzzle without having all the pieces or seeing the full picture. The early modern era gave us some of the most fundamental building blocks of modern medicine and hygiene. Remember our friend Antony van Leeuwenhoek and his microscope? His discovery of tiny animalcules swimming in water would eventually lead to our understanding of bacteria and viruses, though it would take another 200 years before anyone really figured out what these tiny creatures meant for human health. The seed of discovery had been planted. Here's a fascinating thought. Many of the things we take for granted today started as radical ideas during this period. Take hand washing, for instance. When Hungarian physician Ignác Semmelweis suggested in the 1840s that doctors should wash their hands between patients, he was ridiculed by the medical community. Yet his observations during the early modern era had already started pointing in this direction. The period also gave birth to the first public health initiatives. Cities began to realize that leaving garbage in the streets might not be the best idea. Who knew, right? Venice created the first health magistrates to combat plague, marking the beginning of organized public health efforts. These early steps, though small, would eventually lead to the modern systems we rely on today. Let me share something amazing about this era's influence on modern medicine. The Royal Society, founded in 1660, established the principle of sharing scientific discoveries openly. This revolutionary idea meant that when someone figured something out about health or hygiene, others could build upon that knowledge. It's like they created the world's first scientific social network. The early modern era also left us with some surprising cultural legacies. Ever wondered why we use the phrase, getting up on the wrong side of the bed? It comes from this period when people believed that the left side of the body was unlucky and getting up on that side would bring misfortune. While we might laugh at such superstitions now, they remind us how far we've come in understanding health and hygiene. Perhaps the most important legacy of this era was the shift in how people thought about cleanliness. Though they weren't taking daily showers or using hand sanitizer, they were beginning to question ancient assumptions about dirt and disease. This questioning spirit would explode during the Industrial Revolution, leading to the sanitation revolution of the 19th century. Think about this. Without the tentative steps taken during the early modern era, we might not have developed modern sewage systems, garbage collection, or public health policies. Every time you turn on your tap for clean water or walk down a clean street, you're benefiting from the gradual awakening that began in these centuries. The early modern era teaches us an important lesson about progress. Sometimes the most significant changes don't happen in dramatic moments, but through small, gradual shifts in how people think and behave. It's like watching a sunrise. You might not notice the exact moment when night becomes day, but eventually you realize everything has changed. As we look back on this fascinating period, we can appreciate both how far we've come and how much we owe to these centuries of trial and error. The next time you wash your hands or take a hot shower, spare a thought for your early modern ancestors. They might not have understood the science of hygiene as we do today, but they took the first crucial steps on the path to modern cleanliness. And perhaps most importantly, they remind us that what we consider common sense today might just be the beginning of what future generations will understand about health and hygiene. Who knows? In a few hundred years, people might look back at our own practices with the same mixture of amusement and appreciation that we feel when studying the early modern era. And so we come to the end of our fascinating journey through hygiene in the early modern era. What an incredible trip it's been, from the perfumed halls of Versailles to the microscopic discoveries that changed our understanding of the world forever. The story of hygiene during this period is really the story of humanity itself, full of contradictions, discoveries, and sometimes amusing misconceptions. Just imagine, while scientists were making groundbreaking discoveries about blood circulation and microscopic life, most people were still throwing their waste out of windows and avoiding baths like the plague, quite literally. Think about King Louis XIV. Ruling over the most sophisticated court in Europe, wearing the finest clothes and jewels, yet taking only 2 baths in his entire life. Or consider the brilliant minds who could build amazing mechanical devices, but still believed that bad air was responsible for most diseases. It really puts our own modern beliefs and practices into perspective, doesn't it? What's truly remarkable is how these centuries of trial and error, these mixed-up beliefs and gradual discoveries, laid the foundation for the modern world we know today. Every time we wash our hands with soap, every time we enjoy a hot shower, every time we walk down a clean street, we are benefiting from lessons learned during this fascinating period of history. Perhaps the most important lesson we can take from the early modern era is that progress isn't always a straight line. Sometimes it zigzags, sometimes it takes unexpected turns, and sometimes it even goes backward before leaping forward. But each generation builds upon the knowledge of those who came before, learning from both their mistakes and their discoveries. As we look back at this period, we might smile at some of their practices, but we should also feel grateful. Grateful for the curious minds who dared to question traditional beliefs. Grateful for the observers who noticed patterns in disease and cleanliness. And yes, even grateful for all the mistakes that helped us learn what not to do. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the surprisingly fascinating world of early modern hygiene, please help us spread the knowledge by hitting that like button and sharing this video with your friends. Every like and share helps us reach more history enthusiasts like yourself. Want to explore more intriguing chapters of human history? Make sure to subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles and ring that notification bell. We've got plenty more fascinating stories coming your way, from the grand palaces of Europe to the scientific revolutions that shaped our world. And hey, leave us a comment below. What surprised you most about hygiene in the early modern era? Would you have survived the no-bath culture of Versailles? Let's continue this conversation in the comments section. Until next time, remember, every time you take a nice hot shower, you're experiencing a luxury that even kings once feared. Isn't history amazing? See you in our next historical adventure.